Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. This is the A+ Tutor. Today we're going over adding and subtracting complex numbers. Complex numbers are the set of all numbers in the form a plus bi, such that a is a real number and bi is an imaginary number. Real numbers are just any number you can think of that's positive, negative, a whole number, or a decimal. Imaginary numbers are numbers that have the imaginary number I in it, where I is just the square root of -1 and I squared is equal to -1. So here are some examples of an imaginary number. You may have the square root of -81. We can write this as the square root of -1 times 81, or the square root of -1 times the square root of 81. We just said the square root of -1 is equal to I, and the square root of 81 is 9, so the square root of -81 is equal to 9i. Or, let's look at the number 5i squared. So, again, we can write this as 5 squared times I squared. We can break that up, which is equal to 25i squared. And we know that I squared is equal to -1, so this is 25 times -1, or -25. So when we are working with our complex numbers, we can always use the fact that I is equal to the square root of -1, and I squared is equal to -1 in order to simplify and solve any of our complex numbers that we are working with. So now let's go over how we actually add and subtract complex numbers. So to add complex numbers, we want to just combine our like terms. For example, we have 2 plus 4i plus 7 minus 3i. Our a in our first complex number is 2, and our bi is 4i. In our second complex number, our a is 7, and our bi is -3i. So we see that these are complex numbers, and we just want to combine our like terms. So our a's are like terms, and our bi's are like terms. So this becomes 2 plus 7 plus 4i plus -3i. And then we'll just combine. 2 plus 7 is equal to 9, and 4i plus -3i is equal to I, so our final answer is 9 plus I. That's how we add complex numbers. Let's see how we subtract complex numbers. To subtract complex numbers, we want to first distribute that negative sign, and then we'll combine our like terms. So let's look at an example. So step 1 is distributing that negative. So we're going to take this negative, distribute it to each of our terms to the right of the negative, or in short, we're basically just changing all of our signs. So we're going to change this to a plus, change our +3 to a -3, and our +5i to a -5i. So our new equation becomes 4 minus 7i plus -3 minus 5i. Now we'll combine our like terms. So our 4 and -3 are like terms, and our -7i and -5i are like terms. So we have 4 plus -3 plus -7i plus -5i. Simplifying this gives us 1 minus 12i as our final answer. So now let's look at some examples of adding complex numbers, then some of subtracting complex numbers. First we have 3 plus 5i plus 8 plus 3i. Again, let's identify our like terms. So 3 and 8 are like terms. 5i and 3i are like terms. So this becomes 3 plus 8 plus 5i plus 3i. which is equal to 3 plus 8 is 11, 5i plus 3i is 8i, and that is our final answer. Next we have 2 plus 7 square root of negative 4 plus 5 minus 5 square root negative 9. Now remember in the beginning of this video when I was defining imaginary numbers, we said that I is equal to the square root of negative 1. So the first thing we want to do before we can start combining any like terms is rewrite these radicals as imaginary numbers. So let's start with the square root of negative 4. This is equal to the square root of negative 1 times 4, or the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 4, which is I times 2, or 2I. Similarly, we have the square root of negative 9, which is equal to the square root of negative 1 times 9, square root of negative 1 times the square root of 9, which is I times 3, or 3I. So now our expression becomes 2 plus 7 times 2I plus 5 minus 5 times 3i, or 2 plus 14i plus 5 minus 15i. Now let's identify those like terms. 2 and 5 are like terms. 14i and negative 15i are like terms. So we have 2 plus 5 plus 14i plus negative 15i, which is equal to 7 minus I. Whenever we see our terms written as radicals with a negative number inside that radical, we can always rewrite that using the rules that we have for our imaginary numbers, which is that the square root of negative 1 is equal to I. Next we have 8 minus 3i plus 4 plus I. Both of our numbers are complex numbers. We're already using our imaginary numbers, so let's just identify our like terms. 8 and 4 are like terms. Negative 3i and I are like terms. So this becomes 8 plus 4 plus negative 3i plus I, and our final answer is 12 minus 2i. Let's take one more example. 2 plus 10 square root negative 16 plus 4 minus 7 square root negative 25. So again, the very first thing we want to do is rewrite our radicals as imaginary numbers. So the square root of negative 16 is equal to the square root of negative 1 times 16, which is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 16. Square root of negative 1 is I. The square root of 16 is 4, so this is equal to 4i. The square root of negative 25 is the square root of negative 1 times 25, or the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. Square root of negative 1 is I. Square root of 25 is 5, so this becomes 5i. This means we can rewrite our original function as 2 plus 10 times 4i plus 4 minus 7 times 5i. And that is equal to 2 plus 40i plus 4 minus 35i. Let's identify our like terms. 2 and 4 are like terms. 40i and negative 35i are like terms. So we have 2 plus 4 plus 40i plus negative 35i. Combining these terms gives us 6 plus 5i. Now let's look at some examples of subtracting complex numbers. So when we subtract our complex numbers, the first thing we want to do is distribute the negative sign to the terms in our binomial and change all of our signs to the right of our minus, including that minus to a plus. So we'll distribute our negative to negative 9, a negative to negative I. Changing all of our signs gives us the new expression of negative 3 plus 6i plus 9 plus I. And now we'll add just like we practiced before. We'll identify our like terms. Negative 3 and 9 are like terms, and 6i and I are like terms. So this becomes negative 3 plus 9 plus 6i plus I. And our final answer is 6 plus 7i. Next we have negative 18 plus 3 square root negative 9 minus 11 plus 5 square root negative 4. So just like we did before, we want to rewrite these radicals as imaginary numbers. So the square root of negative 9 is equal to the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 9, which is I times 3, or 3i. The square root of negative 4 is equal to the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 4, which is I times 2, and that's equal to 2i. So now let's rewrite our expression with these imaginary numbers. This becomes negative 18 plus 9i minus 11 plus 10i. Now we can distribute our negative and change all of our signs. The expression becomes negative 18 plus 9i plus negative 11 minus 10i. Now we'll combine our like terms. Negative 18 and negative 11 are like terms. 9i and negative 10i are like terms. So when we add those together, we get negative 18 minus 11 plus 9i minus 10i, and that's equal to negative 29 minus I. Next we have negative 5 plus 15i minus negative 3 plus 3i. Again, we want to distribute that negative. So we'll distribute it to our negative 3 and to our 3i. When we change all the signs, our expression becomes negative 5 plus 15i plus positive 3 minus 3i. Now we can combine our like terms. So negative 5 and positive 3 are like terms. 15i and negative 3i are like terms. So this becomes negative 5 plus 3 plus 15i plus negative 3i. Adding those together, we get negative 2 plus 12i as our final answer. And here's our last example. Negative 11 minus 9 square root negative 16 minus negative 9 minus 3 square root negative 25. So we want to first rewrite our radicals as imaginary numbers. So the square root of negative 16 is equal to the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 16, which is I times 4, or 4i. And the square root of negative 25 is equal to the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25, which is I times 5, and that's equal to 5i. So we can rewrite our original expression as negative 11 minus 9 times 4i minus negative 9 minus 3 times 5i. And this simplifies to negative 11 minus 36i minus negative 9 minus 15i. Let's distribute our negative sign and change all of our signs. So this is negative 11 minus 36i plus 9 plus 15i, and we can combine our like terms. So negative 11 and 9 are like terms. Negative 36i and 15i are like terms. And our final answer is negative 2 minus 21i. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed and I hope you learned something. Please leave a comment down below if there are any topics you'd like for me to review. I upload new videos every week. You can also find me on Instagram and on Facebook at the A+ Tutor. Make sure you subscribe to my channel so you never miss another video. See you next time.